Trump orders preparations for a long-term Iran blockade. Iran's army says the war is not over. And the Lebanese Prime Minister accuses Israel of violating international law. Good morning and welcome to the first transmission of the day with the news bulletin. We start with our first item. Britain's King Charles tells the US lawmakers that the UK and America remain united in defending democracy despite divisions over the Iran war. King Charles addresses a joint session of Congress during a 4-day state visit, stressing that the UK and the United States will remain steadfast allies despite current disagreements. His remarks come amid tensions with US President Donald Trump, who has criticized the UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, over the Iran war. Charles highlights the unity in protecting citizens and upholding democratic values, while also calling for continued support for Ukraine to secure a just and lasting peace. He says the transatlantic partnership is more important now than ever. In a Truth Social post, the US President Donald Trump criticized Germany's chancellor over Iran deepening divisions with European allies. Trump lashed out at German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, accusing him of supporting a nuclear-armed Iran, a claim that misrepresents Merz's position. The criticism follows Merz's remarks that Iran's leadership is humiliating the United States in the ongoing efforts to end the war. He also questions Washington's strategy, saying it remains unclear how the conflict will conclude. The exchange highlights widening rifts between the United States and the European NATO allies, already strained by disagreements over Ukraine and broader security issues. In another Truth Social post, the US President Donald Trump said Iran was in a state of collapse and was urging Washington to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Donald Trump said Iran had informed the United States it was in a state of collapse and wanted the Strait of Hormuz reopened as soon as possible. The strategic waterway remains vital for global energy flows, and any disruption continues to raise concerns over shipping, security, and market stability. There was rather no immediate confirmation from Iranian officials on Trump's remarks. The Wall Street Journal reported that US President Donald Trump had ordered preparations for a long-term blockade on Iran. The journal reported that the president had directed aides to prepare for a prolonged blockade on Iran, concluding that the risk of renewed strikes or withdrawal outweighed the consequences of sustained pressure. The report cited officials saying that Trump remained committed to demanding a suspension of Iran's uranium enrichment for at least 20 years. It added that Tehran had requested several days to consult before submitting a revised proposal through mediators. Moreover, the White House said that President Donald Trump discussed an Iranian proposal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said President Donald Trump met with top security advisors to review an Iranian proposal linked to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The discussions come as broader negotiations over the war continue, with the strategic waterway remaining central to global energy flows and regional stability. Iran's army said it did not consider the war over and remained on a wartime footing despite a ceasefire in place. Iran's spokesperson, Brigadier General Mohammad Akramania, said that the country remained on full wartime footing despite a ceasefire that took effect on April 8th. He said Iran had continued updating its target list, training forces, and producing new military equipment since the fighting stopped. Armenia cited a lack of trust in the United States and its adversaries, signaling continued readiness for renewed conflict. Remarks underscored ongoing tensions despite efforts to maintain the ceasefire. Gulf leaders gathered in Jeddah for an emergency summit, the first since their countries became directly involved in the Iran war. Leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council met in Jeddah to coordinate a response to sustained Iranian missile and drone attacks over the past 2 months. The talks focused on strengthening collective security after damage to energy facilities and infrastructure across member states. The meeting marked the first in-person summit since the conflict expanded into the Gulf. Egypt's foreign minister held talks with regional and European counterparts on U.S.-Iran negotiations and rising tensions. Foreign Minister Badr Abdel-Ati held a series of calls with counterparts from Oman, Jordan, Germany, and the United Kingdom to discuss fast-moving regional developments, particularly the U.S.-Iran negotiations. He briefed them on Egypt's diplomatic efforts as all sides stressed the urgency of reinforcing talks to reach a political settlement and prevent further escalation. The ministers praised Egypt's coordinated role and agreed to maintain close consultations, emphasizing that diplomacy remains key to regional and global stability. The UN General Assembly President called for an emergent ceasefire, warning that the Iran war is worsening civilian suffering. United Nations General Assembly President Annalena Baerbock called for immediate efforts to secure a ceasefire in the Middle East, saying the Iran war is deepening the crises across multiple fronts. Speaking in New Delhi, she warned the conflict is intensifying humanitarian pressure and disrupting global stability. Baerbock stressed that ending hostilities is critical as violence and blockades continue to impact civilians and key supply routes. We now head to Rana Al-Qassas in our newsroom to talk to us more about this. Rana, to you.
Thank you so much, Riham. And for further analysis, we're joined from our host by Dr. Nariman Mustafa, strategic and political analyst. Welcome to Qnews. How do you assess Iran's current strategic position? Is it gaining leverage or losing ground in this war?
Hi, thank you for having me. Iran, I think technically and regionally, Iran has gained leverage through the networks of its proxies in the region, like the Hezbollah and Houthis and Iraqi militias. I don't think, however, that Iran is losing ground also strategically, because you have to look at the war in Iran as it's not how do you say that it's not only based on Iran. We shouldn't only look at Iran and think if it's losing or not, because it also depends on the U.S. situation. The U.S. has a deteriorating government and administration, and the Iranians are actually depending on that. Economically, I think Iran is actually, after 47 years of sanctions, they can sustain the difficulties that they are having right now in response to the war. So they have learned to self-sufficient themselves from a domestic ground. I think that Now everyone in Iran is rallying around the flag. So I don't think by far they are losing. I think they are actually winning on a strategic and regional front.
Okay, with negotiations stalled at this point, are we heading towards a prolonged Cold War scenario between the United States and Iran?
In the sense of what Cold War is, if we're referring to the situation between the US and Russia, I don't think it's anything like it. I think what we're witnessing now is a war of attrition.
Do you mean US and Iran or US and Russia?
No, I'm referring to the historical Cold War concept between
You're discussing historical war, okay.
Yeah, but it's not the same. It's more of a war of attrition. In fact, it's called a war of choice in the US. It's more of a standoff kind of situation. They're both waiting to see what the other side has to offer. And I think Iran is actually taking an advantage of how bad the US administration is handling the internal affairs as well as the foreign affairs as well. So for the time being, it would be a war on the media, as we have seen the Lego videos, how the Iranians stepped up the game and trying to fight Trump in his own, throne, because he was the one who started the Truth Social, and he called it truth in terms of referring what truth from his own perspective is. And he's just denouncing every other, news on the media as fake. So they're stepped up their game in media. They have also had this proxy warfare where they have their allies, the Hezbollah and the Houthi in Yemen, is actually, stepping in whenever they're needed. In terms of economic warfare, I think we can call it that way because the Strait of Hormuz is controlling 20% of the global oil, and it's also controlling how the shipment of fertilizers and as well as heliums, which is used in technology. So you can call it an economic war, you can call it a proxy war, you can call it a standoff situation, but I don't think it's Cold War per se.
Okay, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, as you mentioned, has become Iran's means of control or influence over shaping global pressure on Washington. How do you read this?
I think, as the U.S. has, said multiple times, that they're not in need of, the Strait of Hormuz, which is on the ground. It's quite controversial because if it's not important, why are you blockading it? But again, it's vital. It's important because, like I said, it controls 20% of the global oil and the export and import of the shipping of goods and services.
Can I jump here and ask you if Iran is using this as a card at this point?
Sorry?
Can I jump in and ask you, is Iran using this as a card, a very important card in this so-called war, because you don't want to say it's a war? Do you read that Iran is using this as a card in pressuring the United States and Israel?
Yes, they have actually they have been planning this situation for a long time. They have just realized how powerful the Strait of Hormuz to everyone else globally, especially in Europe, the US, technically, of course, the Middle East. But what I'm personally, kind of worried about is that everyone now is starting to think of a way to move away from the Strait of Hormuz, which is probably in the future that everyone would actually have come up with a solution. What if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked? Now we have this as a substitute, and that's actually what the GCC is trying to think of right now. And I don't think that Europe would be far ahead in thinking of a substitute for the Strait of Hormuz. So using this as a card would work now, but I don't think it would work once other countries find a solution for that.
Are you convinced that Iran just figured out that the Strait of Hormuz is very vital and important geographically, and that it can play cards with it and take leverage over the United States at this point?
Yeah.
They just figured it out, Iran and Iranians?
they had an idea of how important it is, but they didn't think that it's that vital. That's once you want to do something and you want to take it, try it if it works or not. So the Iranian has surpassed that. They already know it's effective. They already know that countries in Europe, countries in the Middle East, they are and India and Pakistan, they're drastically affected by this. But again, what I'm worried about is that this card that they so-called are playing now, if the conflict prolonged, other countries will look for substitute for a Strait of Hormuz, and in the future it will not be as vital as it is right now.
Okay. Okay. Has the balance of power inside Iran shifted toward the military, especially the Revolutionary Guard, and what does that mean for decision making?
Well, I think every citizen, every Iranian citizens right now, regardless of how they disagree with the government in Iran, they think that it's not a situation where they have to rally down the streets and call for the government to be toppled or something. So they're more focused now on defending their country. They're using what we call again the rally around the flag concept, where everyone is just thinking we need to defend the Iranians. In fact, if you go over the social media, you'll find a lot of the Iranians are boasting all those nationalistic pride. So it's more of we're defending Iran right now. So the IRGC, they are in practice and in theory part of the how to say that, the iron hand of the government. But to the Iranians, at least now, they are the ones who are defending the country. Also, we have to highlight that although there is a disagreement within, the Iranian foreign minister and the IRGC in terms of we want to reach an agreement with the U.S. and they're more of a diplomatic, and the IRGC, they want to actually militarize themselves and just hit back. They, at the end of the day, diplomacy has to be reached. That's why Arakci is actually doing his best to meet the Americans halfway, and also the Americans are trying to meet him halfway, because they want to. They don't want to be in a state of war, because as we know, that war has a bad effect on economy and also on the stability of the country itself, and also the Iranians, they want to rebuild themselves.
Why has the United States maximum pressure strategy failed to produce a clear breakthrough so far, considering Donald Trump's statements yesterday that the situation will remain as is?
Well, for two reasons. I think it comes down to the culture. The Iranians, they are so proud of the Persian being a Persian themselves, and also the respect. This country has long been trying to seek respect of every other regional country, and either in their neighborhood or the internationals as well. So and also the patience. So Iranians are also famous for being patient. So Trump can prolong this as much as he can, but from my own perspective, the Iranians will not break. They have waited 8 years when Saddam was fighting them. They have lived their lives normally. They weren't affected by it. If you go to Iran at that time of the war, they were actually doing their day-to-day business. They weren't affected by the war, even though they were, it was more intense and they weren't prepared for it. Now, putting this war in perspective, 47 years, they have been prepared for the U.S. and they're actually employing the patience, they're employing the pride that they have, and they're employing all the things that they have invested in actually building up so far. Also, it's worth noting that they kind of don't respect the U.S. administration, because in order for businesses and economy and even in policies to actually thrive, there has to be a respect on both sides. And I don't think the Iranians actually respect the current U.S. administration. So as you can see it also through the Lego media and how the Iranian embassies have been responding to Trump's truth social posts. So it's a kind of respect. Yeah, go.
How likely is escalation beyond the current theater? Could this conflict draw in more regional or global actors, of course, considering the global economy, which is, and of course, geopolitical change in the Middle East, and of course, it's getting deeper and deeper. How do you read this?
I think we have to wait for a while, for a few days, because according to the U.S., if they're following the rule book, should we say, the U.S. Army shouldn't be deployed overseas more than 60 days. And in a few days from now, they should get a second congressional approval from the Congress to whether the troops should stay outside and continue this military operation. That's what he called it, military operation, when he started this. So we have to wait out and see what will happen after 60 days for that.
Okay, from Ari Hus, that was Dr. Nariman Mustafa, strategic and political analyst. Thank you very much for your insights and for joining us here on Q News. And now we move back to my dear colleague Reham Morsi in our studio. Reham.
Thank you so much for that in-depth interview there. And we move on to the UN nuclear watchdog, saying most of Iran's highly uranium remains at a facility near Isfahan. The International Atomic Energy Agency said it believed the majority of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile remained at a nuclear complex outside Isfahan. The Director General, Rafael Grossi, said the agency was seeking access to inspect the site and verify the material's presence. He added that the IAEA also aimed to expand inspections to include facilities at Natanz and Fordow, which are believed to hold additional nuclear material.
So I think as a negotiator, as a diplomat, as a man of peace...
Iran's UN envoy warned of consequences over what he called U.S. maritime piracy targeting Iranian vessels. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Amir Saeed Irvani, sent a letter to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning of the fallout from what he described as U.S. maritime piracy against Iranian ships. He held Washington fully responsible for the regional and international consequences, stressing Tehran's right to respond. Ravani also urged the Security Council to intervene and compel the United States to release detained vessels and assets unconditionally. Qatar warned against a prolonged frozen conflict in the Gulf as U.S.-Iran peace talks stalled. Qatar cautioned that the region risks sliding into a prolonged and unstable stalemate as negotiations between Washington and Tehran fail to make progress. A foreign ministry spokesman warned against this conflict that could reignite any moment, stressing the need for a sustainable and lasting resolution. U.S. officials expressed concern about a potential frozen conflict with Iran with no clear path to resolution. Axios reported that U.S. officials were increasingly worried about being drawn into a prolonged stalemate with Iran, with neither a decisive war nor a diplomatic breakthrough in sight. The report said President Donald Trump remained undecided between launching new military strikes or waiting to see the impact of ongoing economic pressure on Tehran. U.S. Central Command said American forces boarded a vessel in the Arabian Sea as part of enforcement to the blockade of Iran. The U.S. Central Command said Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit boarded a commercial vessel suspected of heading towards Iran in violation of the blockade. After conducting a search, forces released the ship upon confirming it would not call at an Iranian port. CENTCOM said operations to enforce the blockade remain ongoing across the region, adding that dozens of vessels have already been redirected to ensure compliance with the restrictions.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Israel released footage showing its troops operating in southern Lebanon as strikes expanded despite a ceasefire. The Israeli army released footage it said showed ground operations in southern Lebanon as strikes continue to expand along the northern front. Lebanese authorities reported at least 4 people killed despite a ceasefire in place, underscoring ongoing violations and rising tensions along the border. Heavy explosions were seen in southern Lebanon as Israel warned residents to evacuate ahead of an expected strike. Plumes of smoke and projectiles were seen across southern Lebanon despite the U.S. brokered ceasefire. The Israeli army issued urgent evacuation orders for more than a dozen towns, warning of imminent operations. It said the move followed violations by Hezbollah. Israeli forces have continued strikes and maintained positions inside parts of southern Lebanon. In response, Hezbollah has sustained drone and rocket attacks on Israeli forces and northern Israel, keeping tensions high along the border. Lebanon's prime minister said that targeting civil defense workers was a war crime, accusing Israel of violating international law. Prime Minister Nawaf Salem said the targeting of the civil defense personnel during humanitarian work constituted a new war crime by Israel. He accused Israel of continued violations of international humanitarian law, adding that Lebanon would intensify efforts to condemn the incident in international forums. Salem said the government would work to mobilize pressure to compel Israel to halt the ongoing breaches of the ceasefire agreement. Israel's prime minister said forces destroyed a major Hezbollah tunnel as operations expanded across Lebanon. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israeli forces blew up what he described as a massive Hezbollah tunnel as operations continued across multiple areas in Lebanon. In a video statement, he said the military was targeting militant infrastructure and would continue to strike. Netanyahu added that Israeli forces were operating across a wide range of locations, including areas south and north of the Litani River, as well as the Beqa Valley and northern Lebanon. That's it for now for our news bulletin, but before we wrap up, here's a look at the headlines for this hour. Trump orders preparations for a long-term Iran blockade. Iran's army says the war is not over. And the Lebanese prime minister accuses Israel of violating international law. That brings us to the end of this bulletin. Thank you for watching here at Q News. To stay updated for the latest developments from the region and around the world.